All right, welcome to part 3 in our series on Microsoft Forms to plan our tasks. So in the first video we basically just went through and created a basic task. The second video we talked about assigning that task. In this video we're going to focus on adding checklist items. And checklist items in tasks are basically subcomponents of that task. So as an example, when if the task is to make a sandwich, then a component of that task is going to be get bread. The next one will be get the other sandwich ingredients. Third one might be toast the bread. So you understand that there are different steps made up that make up that task, and in the end those might be broken out as separate tasks. But we're going to assume that we want a way to define a task that has these component steps to it, and that's what those checklist items are. Now, in terms of how we can go about adding the checklist tasks or checklist items, that's actually in if we go into our flow, and this is the same flow that we've been using, so I'm just going to edit the flow. We can take a look at the update task details, because we can't, when we're creating a task, we can't assign or create those checklist items there. But in the update task details, we have fields where we have, and this is a multi-row or sort of a repeating table entry where we can spell out the checklist items. So just in general, in terms of different ways we can add them, we can put those statically into that update task details action simply by typing in the values that we need. And jump back over to that, we need an ID. So each checklist item needs a number, a sequential number. Each one needs a title, which is just the text that displays, and then it needs a value to determine whether it is checked or not. So you could, in theory, populate a standard set of checklist items if your scenario requires that all tasks have the same checklist items. Absolutely. Plugging them all in here directly is the simplest way to do that. Just know that in the future, if that list changes, you need to go into the flow to change what's being created there. And so that's one option, is static entry. We could also use a multi-select choice question on the form. The way multi-select choice questions work is that essentially all of the choices that are selected are returned to flow as I believe it's semicolon separated list of responses. So we could then take that data, parse it out to create an array with the appropriate properties, and then use that, because that in the checklist entry area here, we can switch to array format, which would allow us to just drop in an array of data. It's what we're actually going to do when we get to that point. Now the problem with this option, or with the multi-select choice question, is that you would need to basically think of all of the possible checklist items and have those as choices in that question. And that could be a sizable list. So probably not something you want to put in front of users. If there are 30 or 40 options there, then people are either going to be overwhelmed and select none of them, or they'll say, well, I'm not sure which ones are really needed, so I'll just select them all. So few people will get it right, but most people are going to choose all or nothing. So that's not really a great user experience. The third option, kind of the third practical option here, is a long answer text question in the form. And this gives us the ability or the flexibility to let the person entering the data, submitting the form, type in what those steps should be. We do need to give them a little instruction of how to separate them. But based on that instruction, whatever we tell them to use as a separator, we can then parse that response text, build the array, and assign the array in that update task details action. So that's the way we're going to go. And these aren't the only three options, but these are kind of the three most common, the three that jump to mind first when you think about what forms can do and what Power Automate can do. So let's take a look at how we can, first off, adding that question to the form. So in our same form, the Create Planner task form, I'm going to go down to all the way at the bottom under Importance or Priority. We'll add a new question, and it'll be a text question. And I'll just call it Steps. Actually, to clarify it, call it Checklist Items. Now, one of the things that is important here is that you need to, in order to separate or split or parse, to use the fancy term, to parse this data out later, we need to know how it's some way to separate one item from the next, because this is going to have multiple items. So what I like to do is, well, first off, let's make it a long answer so they can enter multiple lines of text. And I think the simplest way to help people do this, or to guide them, is to say enter each on a separate line, because then we'll have a new line character. So we'll say enter each item on a new line below. And now you'll have some people who don't listen to that, who ignore that and just type them all in a string, and you know what? They're going to get one checklist item, which is all of those things. You're also going to have people who maybe separate them with commas or semicolons or something else, and they're just not going to be parsed properly. Now, if you wanted to use a different character as a delimiter, you certainly could do that. You could say separate each one with a comma, but then what happens when someone has a checklist item that has a comma within it? Or you could say a semicolon, but again, what if they were using a semicolon inside of a checklist item? So if you do want to go with a different delimiter other than a new line, I would suggest using something that is not commonly used. A good example of that is the pipe character. So basically, that's on most US keyboards, it's you hold down the shift key and you press the backslash key that's above the enter key, and you get the pipe character or vertical line. But again, that's just something you might, if you don't have luck getting them to put things on a new line, try using some other delimiter. All right, so that's all we need here. Let's go over to our flow. And now what we need to do is, I'm just actually going to save this and exit out and come back in, just so this is something that you'll want to do anytime you change a form. Exit, if you're already editing the flow, you'll want to leave the flow and come back in, just so that the flow can kind of reassess what's involved, the schema of those response details. So that's what we want to do. Now, in order to make this work, we're going to have to create a couple of variables. Number one is going to be an array variable, which is what we're going to use to store the checklist items in. Number two is an integer variable, which we'll use to assign the ID of the checklist item, because it needs to be a sequential number starting at 0. So we know that we can't initialize those variables inside of a scope, so let's just put an action below our assigned task scope here, and we'll say initialize variable, and let's create the var checklist items first, and that will be an array. And as usual, I'm going to copy that and rename it just to keep things straight. Now let's also add another initialize variable action here, and then we're going to call this var checklist ID number, and that is going to be an integer with an initial value of 0. And again, we'll just do a little renaming here. Copy, rename. All right, so that's that. Now what we need to do is get that data from our form and parse it. So that one we are going to do inside of a scope. So I'm going to add a new scope here, and we'll call this get checklist items. All right. So we first need to get those items and parse them, and we're going to do that using the split expression. So, and I'm going to jump the gun a little bit here and say that splitting on the new line character, which is a /n, is a little tricky. So what we're going to do is first use a compose step to basically compose a blank line or a line separator. So let me find compose here, and I'll call this compose new line. And in here, all we're going to do is press enter. That's it. It's a little hard to explain, but I will say that it drove me up a wall bit until I remembered this kind of hack, but it does work. So basically this compose new line is giving us just that new line character. So now we're going to add another compose, and in this compose we're going to use an expression. So we're going to go to expression, and the expression we'll use is split. Split basically takes a string and converts it into an array by splitting each element based on a delimiter. So we'll type in split, and then we'll select as our input the checklist items question. So we know that is, we're basically getting the outputs of the response details. Okay, I really hate this editor. But then we want to split that based on the new line character. So we need to get the, where did that go? Compose new line. And I did try this a number of ways using, basically it's like I said, it's a backslash and the small letter N. Should work, but doesn't. So we'll just go with this. And just so, let's save this, and just before we actually go through the rest of it, let's do a test run to make sure that we're getting that data and that it's going to work properly. So we'll go preview. We'll say checklist test 1. I'll say this is management, start date of the 14th, due date of the 16th, testing checklist items. It's a medium, and here we'll put in, I'll just do step 1, step 2, and just to prove my point about delimiters, I'm just going to put step 3 after that. I'm going to submit this. We'll go over to our flow. We'll see that it's running, see that it's succeeded, and if we go in and take a look at our checklist items, we can see there's our new line, there's our compose, which I didn't name, but this is the array that's created. So we now have step 1, and then step 2 and step 3, because I didn't put a new line there, come in as a single item. So that's the importance of people following directions or choosing an appropriate delimiter. All right, so let me go back to edit mode here, and let's just call this, rename this to compose split checklist items to array. So now what we need to do is take, basically we know we're going to get an array of data, and we need to concatenate that, or we need to build for each item in that array, we need to put it into that format. So looking at that format again, we need to get an ID number, which is going to be an integer, the title, which is the text that people are entering on the form, and then that is checked value. So we need all of these in this format for each of those checklist items. And as usual in that scenario, we're going to use an apply to each, because This is producing an array, and we want to perform some operation on every item in that array. So I'm going to add an action, apply to each, and what are we operating on? We're operating on the checklist items array. Perfect. So now we need to append to our checklist items array variable. So I'll add an action and search for append, and I want to append to array variable, and the array variable we're appending to is checklist items, and the value that we're appending is going to be basically that format. So we've got a curly brace, we've got quote ID colon, and then we're going to call the var checklist ID number. Remember, that was that integer variable that starts at 0, and then we'll go with title, and that will be, because we're operating on this array, which is just an array, a list of those titles, it's just going to be the item. That's it. Simple as that. It's the item that we're currently operating on. And then we need the is checked value. And I don't know why you would create a checklist item that is already checked, so we're just going to make this false. So we need to, but it needs to be the expression false, not just the word false. So we'll go to expression, type in false, click OK, and there we go. And then a closing curly brace. And that's it. So we'll just call this append to var checklist items. Okay, now, so this is going to run, but what we need to do is increment that checklist ID number so that the next time this cycle that this apply to each runs, it increments by 1. So what we need is the increment variable action, which is simply going to say, let us select our integer variable, and we're going to increment it by 1. So the first time it runs, it'll be 0, the next time 1, next time 2, etc., etc. So again, let me rename this var checklist item checklist ID number. Okay. All right, we're getting there. So hit save. And let's do another test here just to be sure we're getting an array that is what we want. So we'll go back here, we'll submit another response, and we'll just say checklist test 2. This will be a management task, 7th to the 10th, another test, medium priority, and here we'll put in step 1, step 2, step 3. Submit, and take a look at our flow. It ran, well, it's running, and it succeeded. So let's see what exactly happened there. Got our apply to each. We can see that for the first one, oh, that's not this is the one I want. So it's building title step 1, step 2 with ID 1, step 3 with ID 2, and if I had 10, it would be, you know, so on and so forth. All right, so that's all good. Now, all we need to do is go into our update task details. Oh, actually, I need to edit the flow and go to our update task details, and for that checklist, we will select var checklist items, hit save, and we're just going to test that by rerunning the last one. All right, so it's running. It ran successfully. We can go into our task details and see there are our checklist items 0, 1, 2. And if we go over to our plan, we'll see there is our tests, and here is the last run. So we've got, it was assigned to Robert Hogan because it's a management task, and there are step 1, step 2, step 3. Now, once it's in here in Planner, I can rearrange these. I can promote any of these to separate tasks. Whatever I need to do, I can do once it's in Planner. But it's getting those checklist items in there in the first place. So that's basically it. That's all I was going to cover today. However, just talking through a couple of other ways, other options, because what I showed was using a long answer text question, which is going to work in some situations, but there are going to be other scenarios and some other options you might want to think about. The first off, and this is the one that kind of came to my mind as I was thinking through different options, was you might have a standard set of checklist items per category of task. So maybe if it's a, an estimate, repair estimate task is always going to have, these 3 steps of contact customer, visit customer, write estimate. So you could do that, basically have a question on the form, which is, what kind of task is this? They would select repair estimate, and that would generate a standard kind of boilerplate list of checklist items that always go with that kind of task. Another option I also considered was using Power Apps, because in Power Apps, essentially you could, and this wouldn't necessarily be for the end users that are creating the tasks, unless those end users are within the team, but more so for the people who are doing the triage. So if you've got one person who sort of, once that task comes in, they're saying, okay, well, that's a carpentry job, so they need to do step, this step, this step, and this step. So basically in that Power App, you would have, a form more or less where they see this is the task that was created, and then they see a gallery of various checklist items where they can select to add that checklist item to that task. So that's something. The first one there, dynamically lists based on a type or category. I kind of put that together with what I already showed about building the assigning the tasks by category or by role. You could do something very similar. The Power App one, I don't have anything in the other videos showing that, but it's something that I could certainly put together. It's actually something that I have a kind of a back burner project where I could use that. So I might do a video on that in the future. In terms of this particular video series, this is kind of my original intent, but I think I'm going to do one more video on how to add attachments, because that is something that's fairly normal. So, and again, thinking of kind of the use case of a request form, like a repair request or a work request, you might want to include an image there of what needs to be fixed or what the problem is. So putting that image into the task itself would be a really logical and helpful thing to do. So look forward to that. It's probably going to be at least a few days, but check back later and you should see part 4, which is adding attachments to tasks. So hopefully this was helpful to you. If so, feel free to give me a like. Otherwise, thanks for your time. Have a great day, and have any questions, leave them in the comments below.